Welcome back to Coding Temple's Agile Leaders, the skill mastery podcast where we help you develop skills to advance as a leader through insights from accomplished founders and operators. I'm your host, Evan Shai. Today we are joined by my dear friend, Tim Alvis, a truly exceptional product and technology leader who has gone from running teams at Amazon and Microsoft to leading technology organizations at firms like Spins, resulting in over $1 billion exit in 2021. So he knows a thing or two about scaling product and technology teams. Thank you so much for being here with us, Tim.
No, it's a pleasure.
I guess, a good place to start is just giving the audience a sense of your journey here and maybe some of the experiences and milestones you've had along the way.
Yeah, I started off as a software developer and really went up through that career path first to being a CTO and then a co-founder. But as you know, when you're a founder, you put on a lot of hats, and one of those by default was product. A few series of interesting twists and turns, and I ended up at Amazon for a few years where I learned a great deal about product at various scales, and some of those scales are extreme. Some of the small business units that they have senior managers leading effectively are larger than some of the businesses that I was involved with entirely before that. After Amazon, I joined Spins, as you mentioned, and led product and technology there for 4 years through the exit towards the end of 2020 and early 2021. And since then, I've just been helping companies take advantage of some of the hard-earned scars, lessons there, turn things around for their product and tech orgs.
I feel like it's such a unique, I happen to be privy to, but if only, so many other founders and product leaders ultimately were aware of this asset that is available to leverage right now and pick apart all your expertise and just how thoughtful you are about product. It'd just be super valuable to so many folks out there. So I'm glad I get to bring you on an experience like this, get to have some conversation, to hopefully unpack some of that value for others. But maybe given the kind of underlying premise of the podcast, what skills have been the most impactful for you and your success throughout your career, would you say?
Yeah, I think, one outlier, and I don't know that it's necessary all the time for everyone,
Okay.
But for me specifically, having that tech background has made collaboration with tech orgs much easier than it would have been otherwise. I can get into the conversation, and while they obviously have deeper mastery of some of the specifics of the subject than I do,
Sure.
I'm not feeling lost, right? Like we're able to really bounce ideas off of one another. I think, though, that if you ask me to rank what is globally most important 10 years ago and today, the answer would change a little bit. And the answer today, I really believe that communication, learning how to take complex concepts and ideas and communicate them to very different audiences, is probably the most important skill you can develop if you want to rise up in leadership, because influence requires that skill. And there just isn't a substitute for it. Like, no matter what level of mastery you have, if you can't get it easily communicated to many different audiences that have different needs, it's not going to come through.
No question. Even with some of the technological advances that are certainly getting a lot of airtime right now, I think it actually emphasizes the criticality or the importance of communicating and interpersonal relationships and stakeholder management and that kind of thing, because your ability to ultimately not only create strategy, but your ability to actualize that strategy inherently relies on other people and other people working together in some meaningful way, and being able to truly own that strategy and understand it and make decisions in real time. So communication continues to be kind of a common thread, maybe the most durable skill of all of them. So it certainly resonates with me. Was that challenging for you at all throughout your career, or did that kind of come naturally?
I would say the audience tailoring was challenging. Because when you come from a tech background, you tend to work largely with engineers, and there's just an expectation that you don't have to explain things, right? Like, you go long form in some places, shorthand in others. When you get into a world where you're trying to influence people from marketing, sales, commercial, tech, product, all at the same time, and you're trying to get inside the heads of your customers, like, tailoring the communication for all those different audiences and having it be consistent, where everybody, even though they got a very different message, comes away with the same idea or same concepts and alignment there. Yeah, that took a lot of practice. I'll say I also had like a default resistance to PowerPoint. Like I believed and still believe that in most cases when you see PowerPoint in use, like most people probably do a disservice to the message when they're using PowerPoint, only because it's so much harder to communicate in that small format. Like getting it succinct but yet thorough. It's just such a tough balance to hit. So yeah, I think that took some practice. What helps is like that general skill of, and I call it a skill, but it's an attribute, a trait, whatever it might be, but it can be learned, but just empathy. I mean, I think no matter what level of seniority you're at, developing that empathy and leaning in is critical. And communication it's an empathetic skill, right? You're trying to hear what you're saying from the perspective of someone else.
How do you go about doing that? It's just something I've actually been thinking quite a bit about. I spent a lot of time thinking about, communicating effectively, and having been in basically a founder, CEO role the vast majority of my career, that has always been a very, very important element of how I create value. And I've certainly struggled with it in a variety of different ways over the years. And I think empathy is a common theme that I keep trying to think about, but it's easier to understand intellectually, challenging, at least in my experience, to practice in reality. Is there any kind of techniques or things that you've done to try to build empathy for a diverse audience?
Yeah, I think the desire to have empathy is one that's harder to train. But so long as the person has that, right, the tools on that perspective are different. Like if you have desire to get it, now it's a matter of figuring out how do you actually go from empathy to understanding. Like I want to feel what they feel, but now I deeply understand them and know why they feel that way, motivations behind the feelings. And I don't know that it's a very technical technique, but certainly getting out of your space, your headspace for a minute, and imagining what they do on a daily basis. Like how are they incentivized? What is their measurement for success? When they wake up on Friday and they're thinking about wrapping the week, what did they do that week that made them feel like they made a difference at whatever it is that is most important to them? And trying to come at it from that perspective of like, forgetting, especially when you're in a startup, you can get so hyper focused on this is what we need, what's good for us, what's good for the business. But ultimately, the impact that's going to make you sticky, that's going to make you grow, that's going to make customers happy is if you're focused on what's going to make a difference for them, less so for you. And finding that alignment, that convergence where what is good for you is also good for them is the magic trick.
That's actually pretty applicable and very helpful. Trying to almost think in a reflective way about their week, the types of experiences that they had, what they feel proud about. At least for me, that's kind of particularly helpful framing to truly kind of walk in those shoes, or at least try to. Given your experience across a wide range of team sizes, different products that you've taken to market, how do you think about decision making in technology and product development, especially when facing complex challenges?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind is it doesn't come naturally. You can learn to have this, but is to develop a deep discomfort with knowable unknowns. Mm-hmm. Like to not have something remain an assumption that doesn't have to be. That first peeling away of assumptions are sinkholes. Like when you step in them, you have no idea how deep they're going to go, how much of the neighborhood they're going to swallow. So getting rid of that early and identifying it is really, really important. The other is to not treat them like, maybe dating myself a little bit, but the evil Knievel jump. The guy would take a motorcycle and hit a ramp and go across the canyon. It's fun to watch, but his success is pretty binary. He either lands and makes it to the other side, or he falls to the bottom of the canyon and everything burns. So you don't really want that for your business. Instead, what you want to find is, okay, it may not be as thrilling, but how can I take that bigger goal and find smaller goals that will lead me there? Even if it feels like you're adding 50% to your timeline up front, because, now I'm doing all these small steps and checking my work. You're actually going to get there faster almost every time. And figuring out like, okay, how do I make the complex less complex by finding simpler pieces? That's another piece. The other is, don't fall in love with complex frameworks and processes in the middle of it. You already have these complex business challenges. It's already you versus the world, and the world is extremely complex. Adding a new obstacle in your way to where you have to maintain adherence to this thing that's not necessarily value generating can also be a killer. So keep it simple, break it down into smaller pieces, and get really uncomfortable with what you don't know.
I love that. I want to circle back if there's any kind of frameworks that you found to be particularly helpful. But before we dive into that, I'm a believer, kind of the general principles that you've just hinted at least, where it does make sense early on to, dare I say, slow down, but focus on these kind of, the core assumptions, running kind of tight, lean experiments. Ultimately, that allows us to move with higher velocity and focus later on. I have experienced, though, some challenges oftentimes of getting the rest of the organization or maybe the team to appreciate the importance of doing those little things. People tend to kind of want to jump to the solution and the features, and kind of having to keep corral people to focus on, well, we haven't determined or defined whether or not this assumption is something we can validate and we believe in and can put our chips behind. Anything that you've done, or strategies to try and kind of rally a team around understanding the importance, or do they just need to experience the pain firsthand of not doing these things, like a lot of us have?
I would say if you can share a little bit of a historical moment with them where they've experienced that pain and you've experienced it, that can help them want to, bite off the smaller pieces. I think it depends on the audience too. This is another one of those, how do you tailor the message? If you're working with an engineering team, they do this really as part of their work every day.
Yeah.
Like none of them take a ticket that's like 13 weeks worth of development work, start to finish, right? Like they break it down, and they break it down because they know that it's actually, even though it is now 13 things that they're getting done individually, one a week or maybe even more, it still ends up being faster, right? Because they're able to course correct and take learnings forward. So sometimes it's just finding something that is relevant, that works the same way that they're comfortable with. Other times it comes down to, I really like, the longer I go, even though if you're young and you think, oh, the more experience I have, the more people will just want to listen. And then as you gain more experience, the more you realize it's not about getting them to listen, it's about figuring out how you can make a decision together. So often it's not a matter of me saying we have to break it down in these pieces. It's a matter of saying, all right, if we do it this way, here's the risk. Are we okay if we fail in this way? Because it's crashing and burning at the bottom. And if you're not okay crashing and burning at the bottom, then we have to find another jump. And so getting them to make the decision with you, and then you come to this natural equilibrium. And sometimes, depending on how new you are to the org, the amount of influence you have, you're going to have to soak up some pain sometimes, because while you might want to break it down more, the org doesn't want to go there yet. So you're going to have to save that next conversation for another day and work through it.
I could double click in about 5 different components of that answer. So fascinating. Like zooming up a little bit, when you think about, you said kind of bring people along in the decision-making process. And that certainly is kind of my posture, my bias generally. And at times I think, especially with fast moving kind of agile situations, I've learned or grown to accept that sometimes a rapid decision, being decisive, and even when it is kind of a top-down scenario, sometimes is necessary, but more often than not, want to drive consensus and collaborative decision-making, not just so other people buy into it, but ultimately I think that's how the best ideas are going to surface, when you do get that kind of healthy debate and conversation and diverse perspectives into the process of decision making. When you've worked on larger teams and certainly led, really large teams, when you think about trying to achieve consensus among diverse stakeholders and the challenges that come with that, are there particular strategies or frameworks or methodologies or maybe just best practices that you found have been effective at aligning teams, outside of the both the product org, engineering, as well as maybe outside of those teams specifically?
Yeah, I think generally exactly what you said too you can't always achieve a consensus. You just can't always get there. You can't always bring everyone along. And I think depending on the amount of accountability that you have in the role, sometimes you're just going to have to, like another principle that I absolutely happily stole from Amazon, but they have one called disagree and then commit.
Mhm.
And it's a tough one for folks, especially you hire people who dedicate a significant portion of their career to mastering a subject, and they have a leader who disagrees with them, doesn't want to go the direction they want to go, but makes the decision. That's their decision to make. Your job is not to endlessly debate the decision anymore. Now it's around execution. Because another thing you learn is, look, if you've got 50 ideas and you pick the fifth best of those 50 instead of the first, if you execute well, if you really nail it, you're going to outperform someone who picks the first best idea but executes poorly. So the execution matters even more than the selection process at a certain point. So that committing is really important. In terms of tools to actually generate the consensus, it depends on what kind of window of opportunity you have to build that. If you're new to an organization and they're not expecting you to make key strategic decisions in like your first 90 days, one of the best things you can do for yourself to give yourself sort of some investment in that consensus up front is get some agreement on the principles that matter. So for example, like we fall in love with problems, not solutions. So we're problem focused. We think about customer problems first, their outcomes first, rather than what we need first. And we certainly don't get focused on features and product ideas and that sort of thing. You know, another empathy trumps genius, like really just getting sort of that principle-based alignment so that now when you start to come to decision making, you can pull out tools that align with those principles to put them into action. That helps. In the actual moment itself, it's around remembering like that empathy thing again coming up. Assume the best of intentions with those you're working with and understand they are wanting to succeed just like you, and come in and offer help. Like the best way to earn consensus is to make someone else's life easier through what you're doing.
I love it, man. As usual in our conversations, I'm taking notes for me to apply later on. Okay, so super helpful. When now we're going to zoom into kind of the product roadmap, prioritization, the types of challenges and obstacles that product and technology leaders are facing on a regular basis. When you do look across, product suite, right, which you've certainly, overseen at a variety of different companies, but when you're not one specific, isolated solution, but you're overseeing a lot of different potential products. And when you're trying to strike a balance between pursuing innovative solutions versus sticking with kind of practical, proven technologies, how do you manage that balance between the two?
Yeah, first thing that comes to mind is I'm uncomfortable with compound risk. And by that I mean, if you're going into an unproven business, you're not sure of the business model yet, whether there's demand there, whether you've actually identified the problem, marrying that with an unproven technology is a great way to just have things completely spiral out of control. Not to mention, if you go through all the pain of developing the technology and overcome it and then find that there's no business there, it still ends up a waste. So compound risk, I try to avoid it. In terms of like how companies tend to operate though, on whether they're playing it too safe or going too experimental, I rarely find one that's neutral. Like it's very rare to like, well, we like to innovate some, but not a lot, do it here where it's important. Instead, you tend to find it's either they're really in love with the idea of fresh tech, really pushing the envelope, right? Really making people stand up and notice how they accomplish something. Or you come into an org and these are typically more mature. They have some momentum and some weight behind their organization, right? They're almost institutional. They're really resistant. All their developers, all their people, they know the product, they know the tech stack, it works for the customers, they understand, they know who to have on call, they know the amount of support tickets. Like there's just a lot of fear around, well, if we start experimenting, are we gonna blow all of this up? So for the first, you have to approach those two orgs differently to get the balance right. The first, we were trying to maybe not necessarily apply the brakes, but guide. It's much more around, okay, great. But we need to recognize, right, that customers really don't care how we accomplish what we accomplish for them. They just care that it's accomplished. So the most important question we can ask for the tech is, does it make a meaningful impact for customers first? And if not for customers, then for us. If it drives down costs, that's great. Why is it great? Well, because it means that we can operate either at a greater margin, which means more investment into more capabilities for customers, or maybe we can reduce price, whatever it might be. Sure. For direct impact to customers, it enables things they can't do. For orgs that are resistant, then it comes down to one exercise I love in those groups is, all right, fine. If we kept everything as it is, Let's imagine for a minute there's a nightmare competitor that emerges on the scene. What can they do? What is the technology that enables them to do that? Why does that make such a difference? And if that's the nightmare competitor that could emerge, what's our path to get there? Like, what would a path for us to get there look like? To sort of break them out and realize that nothing is static. Just because things are safe and institutional for you, the world is moving on and innovating with or without you. So you've got to break out of that mode. But yeah, it's really either encouraging a little more experimentation, or it's guiding the experimentation to places that matters.
Does your strategy or approach to talent and building personnel, hiring, reskilling, does it change at all with respect to a more innovative culture versus kind of a more proven technology, continue to repeat what works type of culture?
It can.
Yeah.
I would say the biggest impact, there's less that tends to, like, there's less you need to do typically in organizations where the issue is more guiding the innovation than it is inspiring it. But in an organization where it's not happening, that can require a lot of retraining, really figuring out what people love to do. Because a lot of that institutional resistance to innovation, it's not that they're not technically capable, it's not that they're not brilliant. It often comes from a place of fear. Like, there's some anxiety or some fear there. So providing some safety, some buffer around, like, we know we're going to fail a little. If you're not failing a little, you're not trying hard at all. So it's okay to fail a little. And that's not going to be, you're not going to be punished, not going to be set aside. And figuring out there are actually some people who are, you have people who are inventors and you have people who are maintainers. Yeah. And someone who loves the maintenance side, don't yank them out of their comfort zone. Because if you're innovating and you have that sort of institutional momentum and weight, you still need people to keep things together while you're experimenting. You can't abandon one ship and just go run over to the other. So really identifying what they want to do, what makes them happy, where you have gaps. But yeah, those organizations, there is typically more turnover.
Sure. When you think about, so maybe not kind of cultural differences internally, but external factors like technological innovation or breakthroughs, AI, how have you historically thought about deciding between either upskilling existing team members or hiring new talent? And what factors kind of influence that decision?
Yeah, and you brought up AI, which is where I imagine, especially right now, a lot of product and tech leaders are asking themselves those questions because of AI.
Sure.
And AI is maybe a little bit, I don't want to say it's unique. We've had things like this before, but it's certainly, in terms of recent history, abnormal in that the window of opportunity is short. Like, advances are rapid and they're coming from everywhere. They will catch you by surprise. And the fundamental skills necessary to succeed at building your own AI, like leveraging AI is one thing. If you're just going to build a wrapper for things and you don't even really need to do much fine tuning, that's getting handled for you. Okay, maybe you're, less needed. But if you're trying to build these models or fine tune these models or select precisely the right model, the fundamental skill sets that you need, they're not going to be there in a full stack engineer typically. Not always the case, but typically. So I would expect there's a little bit more outside in hiring that's going to have to be done, or contracting or training to get people up to speed. And you really don't have time to train everyone. So I would expect to have to pull in some outside resources. In the past, though, with other things, like when people are moving from Rails to Node, or using TypeScript versus Python, or React versus Angular, there you don't want to just completely hire from the outside. You're buying yourself knowledge on the tech stack, but you're losing all the institutional knowledge around what the product does, how it serves customers, where there are risks, dangers, what things fall apart in the integrations and the data cleansing, all of those pieces. So you don't really want to do that. If you have a principal engineer as well, the principal engineer, you should expect, can pick those things up quickly. So I would definitely almost think of it as side skilling rather than upskilling. Like, they're ready to go, have them jump in.
Yep.
For junior hires, you probably have time. You can afford to actually go through that process of training. So if they have good CS fundamentals, which is key, they're not like a React engineer. They're just a computer science professional who happens to be working in React right now.
Yep.
That's critical as well. But I would tend to tip the balance at that point towards towards upskilling and then augmenting the team. If you don't have that principle, though, I would say rather than trying to train the principal engineer, you would probably want to go seek one out.
Okay. When you think about kind of technical skills versus institutional knowledge, and let's kind of bucket institutional knowledge as product domain expertise, understanding the customer, this might be a really challenging one to answer, but when you think about not the principal, entry junior level talent, is either of those, like, would you rather index on people who have the institutional knowledge, the product domain expertise, and teach them new skills, so long as those new skills are able to be taught and not kind of fundamentally transformative for what their foundational skills are? Yeah, like, just, I guess, give me a sense of how important or how you consider both the technical skills and the institutional knowledge, how you evaluate those two dimensions.
Yeah, I mean, especially for the engineering side. So the product side gets a little more nuanced, but for the engineering side, I would much prefer to train them on the domain than I would on the skill set, especially CS fundamentals, like fundamentals of algorithm structures, how those things interact with hardware, like the ability to step into because the other thing that's happening is, even the frameworks, the languages that people are using are rapidly changing. Like, it just didn't happen this fast, or at least it didn't feel like it in the past. Now you have, this was done in Go, and we did this in Rust, and this set of libraries is available in Python and nothing else. Like, you have to be a lot more flexible. So I would rather train in the domain, I think, than the fundamentals. If it comes, though, to a specific, like, would I take someone who had strong CS fundamentals and tremendous domain knowledge, and would I feel any resistance to them flipping from TypeScript to Python? Probably not, right? Like, they're trained. But if they're missing those fundamentals, I would rather just hire and train them on the things that we know specifically for the business. For product, different answer for some domains. There are regulated domains where making a mistake and learning through iteration can be catastrophic for the business, right? You just can't take that risk. So you need them to have that before they step into a seat where they're making decisions. But those aren't common. Most things I would, again, index on, do they have empathy? Do they understand how to leverage tools they've learned? Are they not married to a certain framework? Like, is good product for them about following a framework, or is it about understanding the customer and leveraging the tools that they have? Like, those fundamentals way more important than domain knowledge.
Yeah, totally agree. It's a bit of like a temperament there, almost a worldview that certainly can be learned over time. But I think when I get someone, and this is outside of even product or tech, but just ops generally, particularly kind of like externally facing and or internally facing, but they're interfacing with product, which I would argue is still externally facing, or should be, having the natural muscle and bias towards obsessing over customers, thinking about empathizing for customers, that every kind of decision or product tends to involve an empathetic understanding or desire to understand customers, is just a muscle and a reflex that I can't put a price on. It's just so valuable, and it's contagious across an organization. And the trust that can be bestowed on someone who is thinking that way provides the maximum amount of leverage for me, and something that has taken me a long time in my career, but now I just index so hard on that through almost any kind of hiring process. Thinking about the principal role that you were referring to, so in the event that you have to bring in outside leadership, what are the kind of leadership qualities that you think are most critical when leading a team through periods of significant technological change?
Yeah, and I realize I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record because I keep saying one word over and over. But really, the first thing I look for is empathy. And it's not just for finding out what customers want. It's also empathy within the organization. Mm-hmm. I can't tell you, from working in larger organizations, you'll find too often, before a meeting takes off, somebody's whispering in your ear, oh, watch out for blah, 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 because they don't care about X, Y, or Z. And it's actually not true that they don't care about it. They have a different perspective in which they're trying to approach it. They've been incentivized differently. They're getting different signals. They're hearing different things from the people we're trying to serve than what you hear, because you're not in the same conversations on the same topics. They maybe are talking more to buyers and you're talking more to users, like something like that. So having that empathy to understand that you need to be able to see through your colleagues' eyes, through your employees' eyes, through your customers' eyes, that's big. It also comes through when you're working with people during change to make them feel calm. They understand that you're able to communicate with them in a way that shows that you know what they're going through. Next is authenticity. I would say is probably next. Don't lie. Don't obfuscate. Don't, hide is a strong word. There are some things you just shouldn't share. I guess that would be the third, is like thoughtfulness, like be careful and be calm. But certainly being authentic. Don't tell them everything is great if it's not. Because the moment you lose that trust, really doesn't matter what you say from that point forward. You just can't lead effectively. And the thoughtfulness, like whatever the spirit is that you're looking for from your team. If you want them to be calm, if you want them to be urgent, if you want them to be passionate, if you need them to take a step back, you have to embody that. If you don't embody it, they can't follow it. So as uncomfortable as it may feel, as unnatural as it may feel to your innate wiring, like I'll tell you, for me, one of the hardest ones, we talked before around that you're not the center of the universe kind of feeling. It's not that I think I'm the most important person in the world, but it's easy to forget that what is consuming my mental thought, like 4 or 5 hours a day, might be for someone else something they think about 5 minutes a week. Like I can't expect them. So when it comes forward, like I have to suppress that personal side and instead like literally embody, this is how I want my work to be. So how I come across in those moments, my calmness, my assurance, my assurity, my certainty, whatever it might be, I have to actually express that.
Embodiment being the change or the kind of best practices that you hope to see in the organization, I think is so critical. It's so simple yet so challenging to do for a lot of folks, and it's something I try to have reminders all over the place to to ensure that I'm doing exactly that. But I think it's a game changer when you do. When you think about and across your experience, what are the kinds of skills that are most critical when assembling a diverse engineering and product team, and how do you think about these skills and how they evolve with different experience levels? So specifically between senior, expert, junior level engineers.
Yeah, I think there are some that are shared between them all, right? Like you look for the fundamentals for everyone.
Yep.
I think when you get to a more senior level, like starting backwards from there, what's interesting is I think, and this is, television shows, all of us do it, like they have someone that spikes really high in one thing, like they're the best in the world at DNA analysis or something like that, but every other skill goes to the wayside. They can't make a bologna sandwich, they can't tie shoes, right? Like that's actually not what you want to look for. Like what you're actually looking for is everyone in your organization that you have has achieved like good or great in all the areas that matter. But the most senior people, especially a principal who you want to act as like an internal expert, they need to spike in something while maintaining the rest. And that spike needs to be abnormally high. It needs to be something where they are your go-to. Before you Google, you reach out to Jane. Before you Google, you reach out to Bob, right? Like whoever it is in the org. The other thing is the more senior the role, the more storytelling becomes important. Because the more their job is about influence rather than direct action. If you have someone managing a team of even 30 people, most of the accomplishments that person is going to be responsible for is going to be work that they never personally touched. So that ability to communicate and influence and not motivate, but guide. You don't want people that require motivation. You want people that just need guidance. Motivation is really like, if you find someone who has to be the motivator, your problem probably started at hiring rather than managing.
I love it, man. Again, I could continue to double click on about 1,000 things that we discussed. And fortunately, we stay in touch and keep getting to jam on this stuff. But once again, man, thank you so much for making time for us today to share your insights and experience with the audience. I am confident this thing is going to explode with value and actionable utility for the folks that are watching it. So thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciate it, man.
No, Evan, man. Thanks for the invite. Yeah, Always love working with you.
Awesome.